She spent her life in a world that feared touch, until she found a man who burned through the ice itself to reach her. Rain scoured the northern cliffs, turning the snow to glass and the air to knives. The research compound loomed against the ridge, its floodlights slicing through mist. Inside, the corridors were white and humming, polished, sterile, and without scent. The place smelled only of nothing, and Seraine had learned long ago that nothingness was safer than hope. She signed herself in at the scanner, hung her gray coat, and slipped the thin data slate beneath her arm. Her shift began the same way each dawn, cataloging the melt sequence of ancient cores, logging measurements, listening to the static hum of the heaters. Outside, the wind keened across the ridges, but in here, the world stayed carefully muted. Seraine was good at not being noticed. She had been left at the orphanarium of St. Lucent when she was 4, a plain, quiet child with pale hair and eyes the color of winter glass. Unadoptable, the matrons had whispered. No spark, no color. She grew up believing warmth was something rationed, a thing reserved for brighter souls. By 27, she had mastered invisibility. The compound, with its quiet precision and rules against unnecessary conversation, suited her perfectly, until the day she saw gold under the ice. It began during a geological survey deep within the western glacier, a restricted zone meant only for senior staff. A mild weather anomaly had rolled through from the southern sea that week, raising surface temperatures enough to destabilize the outer tunnels. Her team was delayed by the thaw, but Seraine refused to lose the daylight readings. She convinced herself one quick scan wouldn't matter. The air inside the cavern shimmered with meltwater. Her boots crunched through slush that shouldn't exist this far north. She adjusted her lamp, its beam cutting through walls of ice that gleamed like glass. At first, she thought the reflection was just her own light catching an air pocket. Then she realized it glowed from within. A shape lay trapped inside the glacier, a body, unmistakably human. The ice around it shimmered faintly gold, light threading through as though it carried a heartbeat. She stepped closer, scraping frost away with her glove, and froze. A man, perfectly preserved, broad-shouldered, strong-jawed, head tilted slightly downward as if locked in thought. Long hair fanned across his shoulders, pale gold even through the frost. His expression wasn't peaceful like a relic's. It was fierce, the look of someone who had defied the cold itself. Her throat tightened. She whispered without meaning to, "Who were you?" The sound of her own voice startled her. It echoed sharply, then died against the walls. She should have reported the find at once. Protocol required it. But instead, she lingered, tracing the outline of his face through the ice. Her palm rested flat against the frozen wall. Beneath her glove, a faint tremor answered, a single, impossible pulse. She jerked her hand back, heart hammering. Residual heat, she told herself. The lamp, the pressure shift. Nothing living down here. But that night she dreamed of blue eyes opening beneath the ice, and a voice, low, rough, certain, whispering her name. Over the next 3 days she told no one. She returned during every break, inventing reasons to pass through the tunnel, additional measurements, recalibration, an air quality check. Each time the air felt warmer. Drops of water slicked the floor. Once, she could have sworn she saw his chest rise, the faintest breath stirring frost along his collarbone. She deleted the image from her recorder, then immediately regretted it. When the weather anomaly worsened, Central Command ordered the ridge evacuated until the melt stabilized. She hesitated at the shuttle bay, watching snow slide from the peaks in dull gray waves. If the regulators failed, the pressure inside the caverns would drop. He could be buried again, or released. The thought struck her with panic she couldn't explain. She turned from the shuttle, grabbed her coat, and ran. The lower corridors groaned beneath her boots, lights flickering with every surge in temperature. When she reached the cavern, the air was heavy and damp, a haze of mist hanging where there should have been frost. The ice wall that held him glowed softly, gold light bleeding through seams that hadn't been there before. The surface was wet to the touch. She knelt, breath fogging against the sheen. A crack whispered across the chamber. Another followed, louder. She stumbled back as the glow intensified, steam rising in slow ribbons from the surface. The sound deepened to a low hum, like the glacier itself drawing breath. A sudden burst of heat swept over her face. She shielded her eyes, lamp rattling in her grip. When she looked again, the man's head had shifted fractionally toward her. A single line of meltwater ran down his cheek, catching the light like a tear. Her heart stuttered. The hum became a pulse. A breath, not hers, filled the space between heartbeats. Then his eyelids fluttered. Blue, brighter than glacier fire, steady as command. They locked on her with a focus that pierced through the centuries between them. He moved, slow at first, shoulders flexing against the ice. The sound, cracking, straining, rolled like thunder through the cavern. Her lamp slipped from her fingers. Light swung wildly across walls dripping with gold. The ice split from top to bottom. Steam burst outward, warm and sharp. When it cleared, his face was bare to the air. He exhaled. The warmth of it struck her skin. "You called me." Her voice broke on the answer. "I found you." No difference. The final sheet of ice shattered, collapsing at his feet. He stepped forward through the mist, water running from his hair and shoulders in molten rivulets. He was radiant and terrible, a creature of fire and frost reborn into heat. She backed away until the wall caught her, heart pounding. He watched her without blinking, as if relearning the world one breath at a time. "Do not fear me." The words rolled through the chamber, rough, commanding, but gentle underneath. A hand reached out, steady now. Fingers brushed her cheek, swept a strand of damp hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, too warm, and her eyes filled without warning. No one had ever touched her like that. Not with ownership, not with pity, only with recognition. Outside, wind tore across the ridge, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Inside, the cavern shimmered with steam and gold light. She whispered, barely audible, "Who are you?" His mouth curved, half vow, half smile. "The one who waited for you." The sound of his voice lingered as everything else fell silent. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, the world felt alive. Steam still drifted around them, curling through the fractured cavern like breath made visible. Seraine stood motionless, heartbeat thrumming in her ears. The man before her, impossibly alive, impossibly real, watched her with a focus that stripped the air of sound. Every movement he made was deliberate, measured, as though rediscovering gravity. Drops of meltwater slid down the lines of his throat, disappearing into the shadows of his collarbone. When he reached toward her again, she didn't move. His fingers brushed the sleeve of her coat. "Cold," he murmured, almost curious, and spread his palm flat against her chest, just above her heart. The contact burned through the fabric. Her body trembled. Her voice failed. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then came the faintest smile, a flash of recognition. Her heart was racing. He could feel it. She stepped back until her shoulders met the cave wall. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though she couldn't decide if she meant him or herself. His gaze swept over her face, unhurried, then returned to her eyes. "I was waiting." Outside, thunder rolled across the cliffs, signaling the temperature shift that would soon refreeze the ridge. Seraine knew the storm would cut off all communication. No one would come until morning. She glanced at the ruined chamber, equipment buried under shards of ice, sensors sparking faintly, and then back to him. "You'll die if you stay here." He seemed to understand none of the words but all of her meaning. When she turned toward the tunnel, he followed. The corridors of the compound felt wrong with him in them. His bare feet left prints of steam against the tile. His warmth turned the recycled air damp. She kept her lamp low, leading him through maintenance shafts until they reached her quarters, a narrow, windowless cell with 2 bunks and shelves of data slates. He studied everything as if it were a riddle. His reflection in the polished metal wall startled him. He touched it, palm to palm with his own image, and the sight made something twist in her chest. She pulled a blanket from the upper bunk and handed it to him. "Here, cover yourself." He took it, fingers brushing hers, and the touch lingered. He didn't wrap it around his shoulders. Instead, he draped it over her. "Yours," he said quietly. She tried to give it back. He refused with a faint shake of his head and a look that brokered no argument. The possessive certainty in that gaze made her pulse quicken. He reached out again, his people's way of speaking she would later learn, and traced the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. The gesture was reverent, unhurried. She felt heat rise up her throat. "You shouldn't touch," she managed. "It isn't proper." He frowned, the word unfamiliar. "Proper? It's not allowed." He looked around the room, at the sterile walls, the perfectly folded sheets, the absence of color, and then back at her. "Your world forbids warmth." It wasn't a question. She had no answer. Hours passed. The lights dimmed to night cycle glow. She found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, head tilted toward the vent where the air murmured through. He had pulled her blanket loosely around his waist, nothing more. In the low light, the runic marks along his chest shimmered faintly gold. "What are those?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked down, brushed a thumb over one of the symbols. "Bondfire," he said softly. "It marks the heart that waits for its other." "The other?" He met her gaze. "You." The word hung there, daring her to breathe. She turned away, busying herself with the heater panel that didn't need adjusting. "I found medical supplies," she said quickly. "You need clothes, shoes, food." He stood, closing the distance between them in 2 slow steps. When his shadow fell over her, she felt the heat radiate through the thin fabric of her uniform. He spoke near her ear. "You worry for me. I worry for both of us. If they find you—" He caught her wrist gently, turning her hand over to study her palm as though it were sacred text. "They won't." His thumb brushed along the pulse at her wrist, then higher, tracing the inside of her arm. "You called me, Seraine. You belong with me now." Her breath caught. The possessiveness in his tone should have frightened her. Instead, it ignited something deep and aching, an answer she hadn't known she carried. She whispered, "You don't even know me." He smiled faintly. "I have waited across ages. I know the sound of your soul." She pulled back, overwhelmed, and he let her go instantly. No force, no anger, only patience. That restraint made her tremble more than his touch had. By morning, the communication uplink had failed completely. She kept him hidden, bringing water and ration bars. He examined each thing like a child discovering a new world, fascinated and faintly amused. When he tried the food, he grimaced, then leaned close and whispered, "You eat dust." Despite herself, she laughed, quiet and startled, and the sound seemed to shock him. He touched her mouth lightly, as if to catch the echo of it. "Do that again," he said. "What?" "Laugh." Her cheeks warmed. "It's not something I do often." "Then I will make you remember how." Every word from him landed like a vow. In the days that followed, she taught him pieces of her world. He learned to read the wall screens, to mimic her speech with startling precision. He asked endless questions about the stars, the machines, the rules. When she explained that personal contact was restricted among staff, he shook his head slowly. "In my time, touch was the first truth. Words came after." He demonstrated by taking her hand, pressing it over his heart. The steady rhythm beneath her palm made her dizzy. "Here," he said. "This is truth." She wanted to pull away but couldn't. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why not someone else?" "Because I felt you calling through the ice." He brushed his fingers through her hair. "Because you were alone, and I was waiting." That night, she dreamt of fire blooming beneath frozen lakes and hands finding each other through centuries of glass. Rumors of structural damage spread through the compound. Teams were reassigned, patrols increased. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone discovered the broken chamber. Fear kept her awake. But when she looked across the room at him, sitting by the vent again, eyes half closed, hair catching the low light, calm settled over her. He seemed completely at ease in confinement, as though walls meant nothing to him. Occasionally, he would glance at her, and that single look carried the weight of possession, of certainty. "You are mine," the gaze said. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Each morning she found new excuses to touch him, checking his temperature, cleaning a scrape on his hand, adjusting the bandage she'd placed near his shoulder. Each time, his eyes darkened with warmth. "You care," he would murmur. "Your hands remember, even if your world forgot." When she asked about his people, he told her they lived by the bonfire, souls paired from birth, each feeling the other's absence as a physical wound. When one called, the other answered. She wondered what kind of world could believe in something so absolute, and why that world had vanished beneath ice. Late on the 6th night, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her quarters. Voices, a search team. She motioned for him to stay silent. He obeyed, though his expression hardened to something primal. The light under her door brightened. Inspection mode. She shoved him behind the storage locker, heart pounding. The door slid open. 2 officers scanned the room, one sweeping a light across the bunks. "Section check," the taller one said. "We're missing body heat signatures. One of the lower sensors is reading off charts." Seraine forced her voice steady. "Probably the heaters. They've been erratic since the temperature shift." The officer frowned, adjusted his scanner, and aimed it at the wall behind which Auren crouched. For a breath, she thought the light would flare red. Instead, it flickered, then dimmed. "Faulty," the man muttered, turning away. "Have maintenance replace it." When they left, the door sealed with a hiss. She exhaled shakily, turning to the corner. Empty. Her heart dropped. "Auren?" He was suddenly there behind her, soundless. His hands slid around her waist, drawing her back against him. His breath warmed her neck. "They would not have harmed you," he said quietly, "but I would not risk it." She spun in his arms, half angry, half relieved. "You can't just appear like that. They could have seen—" He cut her off by touching her lips with a finger. "I protect what's mine." Her protest died. The certainty in his tone sank into her like heat through ice. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. His world had taught him that devotion and possession were the same word. He leaned closer, voice low. "When I touch you, does your heart race because you fear me, or because you know?" "Know what?" "That you belong to me." She should have denied it. She didn't. Instead, she whispered, "You can't claim someone just because you found them." He smiled. "You found me." That night she couldn't sleep. Every breath of recycled air felt thick with his scent. Metal, smoke, something ancient. He sat at the edge of her bunk, watching her. When she turned toward him, he brushed his fingers along her temple. "Rest," he said softly. "I will keep the cold away." She didn't mean to fall asleep under his hand, but she did. And for the first time since childhood, her dreams were warm. The compound woke before dawn with the sound of metal, doors slamming, boots striking tile in sharp procession. Air shifted in the vents. The walls, so good at hiding all feeling, suddenly carried it. Urgency, suspicion, a thin edge of fear. Seraine opened her eyes to darkness and knew before the first knock that the lower caverns had been found. She rose without turning on the light. Across the room, he was already awake, sitting at the foot of her bunk with one arm braced on the frame, watching the door as if he'd heard it thinking. The glow from the night cycle strips cut his features into gold and shadow. Something in his stillness said he had counted how many breaths it would take for a guard to cross the corridor, how many heartbeats between the scan and the latch. The knock came, sharp and official. A second followed. She forced breath, past the tightness in her chest, and called that she was dressing, that she would report to Central. The reply carried the clipped rhythm of practiced authority. "Come now, bring your access slate." When the footsteps moved on, she turned, all the things she needed to say crowding her mouth at once. "You can't be seen. Stay hidden. I'll be back." He stood and closed the space between them with a quiet surety that made her heart trip. His hands framed her face. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The heat of him soaked through her skin, and the world that had been empty for so long felt suddenly, impossibly full. "You will come back," he said, voice low against her brow, and somehow the sound of it was both command and prayer. "I will," she whispered, "but if I don't, you must—" He shook his head once, a small, furious refusal that never reached his gentled eyes. The possessiveness there was a tide. It didn't threaten, it covered. "You will." She slipped into the corridor and walked into a world of white light and questions. They had sealed the lower tunnels with emergency locks. Screens along the spine hall displayed a live feed of the discovered chamber. Ice collapsed, sensor arrays shattered, the once hidden wall now a mouth opened by warmth. Anyone with enough imagination could see the shape that had been there. Anyone with enough training could trace who'd come and gone in the hours before the melt. She kept her gaze steady, her voice level as supervisors spoke of anomalies and failing regulators. She lied with the skill of someone who had been taught since childhood to be less, to be quiet, to be acceptable. No, she had not descended after evacuation orders. No, she had no knowledge of an unauthorized presence. Yes, she'd noted the thermal surge in the logs. A thin man with an immaculate tie glanced at her slate and said that her ID had pinged near the restricted wing on the night of the collapse. She answered that the system ghosted during power flickers. Everyone knew it. He smiled without warmth and made a note. When they finally released her, she did not run. She walked, with the same calm that had kept her small all her life, back along the spine hall, down the maintenance stair, through the narrow service corridor that smelled of aluminum and bleach. The quiet down here was a different creature, humming with withheld storms. When she slid her door shut and leaned back against it, she found him standing as though he hadn't moved at all. "They know," she said. He nodded, not in defeat, but in acceptance. He stepped close and, with that instinct of his, found her pulse with his thumb. It steadied under his touch like a skittish thing soothed by a familiar hand. "Tell me what they asked," she told him. He listened without interrupting, his palm shifting to her cheek as if to keep her anchored to the speaking. When she finished, his gaze went to the ceiling as though he could hear patrol routes through ductwork. His arms came around her then, sudden and fierce, not crushing but enclosing, and something in her that had been cold for years simply yielded. "We have to leave," she said into the heat of his chest. "We will." His breath stirred her hair, but not like hunted animals, like those who choose where they walk. He let her go, only to take her hand. She didn't mean to look down at their fingers lacing. She didn't mean for the breath to catch in her chest when, beneath her thin skin at the base of the thumb, a faint line of light answered his touch. Gold, no brighter than a nerve waking. "What is that?" Her voice came out a whisper. He stilled. For the first time since he had stepped out of the ice, certainty slipped. He caught her wrist lightly, turned it to the glow, and closed his eyes. "Bond fire," he said. The word sounded like something both fragile and unbreakable. "It hears you." He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to the luminous line. Heat flared under her skin, a soft ache that felt like relief. When he looked up again, there was wonder in him, and a reverence that made her throat tighten. It marks you because it has found its other. She wanted to say that it was impossible. She wanted to say that she didn't understand, that she had been raised on rules and none of those rules had room for living light under the skin. Instead, she said, "What happens if someone sees?" "Then they will learn a word they forgot," he answered, and the possessive pride in his voice was not for himself, but for her. "They will learn mine." The corridor outside filled with the soft thud of boots. Voices passed, talk of thermal readings and a secondary sweep. He moved before she could think, guiding her to the storage wall, unhooking the lower panel, and sliding it aside to reveal a crawl space of cables and dust. The compound had been built by people who did not expect to be surprised. It was easy, if you were quiet, to move inside its skin. Darkness took them as the panel clicked back. The cable tunnel was warm and metallic, air tasting like old coins and recirculated breath. He went first, shoulders brushing conduits, his hand finding hers again in the cramped black and tugging gently when the path narrowed. The world reduced to touch. The roughness of grips, the glide of wires under her palms, the pulse of his thumb at the web of her hand. Her wrist tingled where the light lay hidden, a moth under the surface of water. They crawled until the tunnel branched. He paused with a hunter's patience, head angled as if listening through steel. "Left," he breathed, and she followed the turn. A meter on, the heat rose. Another meter, and air moved cooler, an exterior breach ahead. He lifted the end grate with barely a sound and peered through. They slid out into a maintenance bay dim with emergency lighting. No one. The outer door stood unlocked, someone too confident or too careless. He wrapped her coat tighter, the gesture automatic, proprietorial, tender. When his knuckles brushed her throat, a second filament of light woke there, a small crescent that mirrored one of the runes across his chest. He noticed. He swallowed. His voice came low, controlled. "It answers where I touch." She made the mistake of stepping back to look at the door before the moment could swallow her whole. The bay's motion sensor flickered at her movement. In the hallway beyond, a scanner panel brightened and painted the air with a fine red grid. She grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadow of the loading rack as two guards strode past. Their voices ricocheted, lower level clear, heat signatures abnormal in Section D, recalibrate and run again. One of them bumped the panel and swore as it glitched, stuttering, the grid smearing like fog. He leaned in and spoke so quietly she felt it more than heard it. "The machines obey the cold, but the fire has its own language." When the guards' boot steps vanished, they slipped through the outer door and into a world cut open by weather. The sky was a torn cloth of gray and gold. Where the glacier once lay smooth and indifferent, cracks had opened like veins, steaming gently in the warm front's breath. Snow slid in slow rivers. Water ran bright as quicksilver through new channels. The wind smelled for the first time in her memory like something other than recycled air. Pine sap far below, minerals newly woken, a wild wetness that stung the nose and tasted like the edges of a storm. They moved along the lee of the building, keeping to the broken shadow where the thermal cameras would be least precise. He walked as if the ground were a map he'd learned before he was born. When she faltered, he steadied her with a palm at the small of her back, and the comfort of that touch did more for her courage than any speech. "Where are we going?" she asked, breath making ghosts in front of her. "Home," he said. "You don't mean the compound." "No." His hand tightened at her waist. "I mean the place the fire remembers." They cut down toward the fracture where she had first found him. The cave had changed. What had been a high-arched chamber was now a fallen throat of stone and glassy walls, steam breathing out in slow curtains. The old sensor box lay gutted at the threshold. Inside, water chattered along freshly carved paths. The place had the feeling of a mouth that had spoken after a long silence and was ready to speak again. He stopped at the lip of the collapse and turned to her, a warrior at a threshold, a man at the door of his own life. He reached for her and framed her face again, thumbs smoothing the tremor that had climbed from her heart to her jaw. His eyes, those impossible, fated, glacier-bright eyes, held her until the room of her panic emptied. "I need to know," she said, because there would never be another moment that kept still long enough to ask. "Why were you there? Why the ice?" He didn't answer at once. When he spoke, his voice had the weight of something recited by heart and carried across centuries. "Long ago, we kept the warmth in our keeping. Not the warmth of fires only, though we had those in plenty, but the warmth that binds one breath to another. The bonfire. It ran through our bodies as it ran through the rivers. It knew our names the way the dawn knows the dark. When fear grew in us, fear of want, fear of loss, fear of one another, we began to hold back touch, to ration it like grain in lean years. The bonfire thinned. The cold came, not the cold of weather, the cold of forgetting. His hand slid down to the mark at her throat, the small crescent brightening beneath his finger. "We were not the only guardians," he said, "and in that we failed. We were too few, and the fear was patient. When the last ember needed a heart to house it, I offered mine. The old one sealed me, where the cold could not snuff me, and the heat could not waste me. They swore I would not wake until the bond's other half touched the glass." Her breath shook. "And that was me. That was always you." The words should have been too much. They weren't. They fit in her like a key in a lock you've carried all your life without knowing what it might open. He stepped back and held out his hand. "Choose," he said, and the quiet command of it was fiercer than any shout. "You said no one ever chose you. Choose me now." The sound of rotors rose, faint at first, then building, security aircraft sweeping the ridge. Voices drifted from above the slope. The compound had followed the same logic she'd used. If something impossible had been freed, it would go back to where it began. She looked at the cave's torn mouth, at the gold threading the cracks like veins of light under skin. She looked at him. The possessiveness in his gaze did not diminish her. It steadied her. To be wanted without apology, to be gathered into an us so sure it could turn weather. She had never been taught the language for it, but her body knew the grammar. She put her hand in his. At the first brush of skin, the runes along his chest flared, tracing themselves in living gold across muscle and bone. The mark at her throat answered, brightening. A new line drew itself along the inside of her other wrist, a tiny flame pointed toward her palm. Heat rose in the chamber, not violent, a waking. The air tasted of rain striking hot stone. He drew her close until their foreheads touched, until their breath braided. The runes hummed under both of their skins like bees working a secret field. She felt it then. The bonfire not as an idea, but as an organism, as a river, as something with a pulse that matched her own. Above them, a shout, there, and the clatter of equipment. A figure appeared at the cave mouth, visor lit, scanner held out like an accusation. The machine in his hand squealed a tone Seraine had never heard before, a panicked stutter that made the man flinch. A second guard pushed past him, and a third. The reticle of a rifle sight skittered across wet stone and landed on Auren's back. He turned without letting her go and placed himself between her and the world. "You're going to get hurt," she said, and only after the words left did she understand they had no power in them. They were the last ghosts of a life spent bracing. He looked over his shoulder at her, the fierce set of his mouth softening with a tenderness that felt like being named. "Do not fear the fire," he murmured. "It only burns the cold away." The first guard shouted. The second pulled the trigger. The rifle coughed, a stuttering thud, and the round struck the wall to Auren's right as if the stone had leaned to take it. The air shook, but not from gunfire, from the thing waking under their skin. Gold bled from him into the space around them, not as flame, but as a pressure, a warmth that rewrote how the air held itself. The ceiling groaned. Steam whirled into a column and unraveled into light. Seraine saw, with the part of mind still able to see, the outlines of what had been a wall widening, a seam brightening until the world looked, for a breath, like a cracked glass of sun. The guards swore and shielded their faces. The scanners screamed and died. Wind, with no source she could point to, lifted her hair and tugged at her coat. She clung to him because there was nothing else in any world she wanted to hold. He bent and spoke at her ear with a possessive gentleness that shook her to her bones. "You're not going back, Seraine. The cold world can't have you. You're mine, claimed by my hand, kept by my heart." The words should have sounded like a lock. They felt like a door. Then the seam split, not with violence but with the relief of a wound releasing pressure. Light poured through, not the white of the compound's bulbs, not the blue of ice, but gold like the hour after dawn when the day forgives the night. It washed the gray from stone, turned the steam to a rain of bright dust. Somewhere, very far and very near, water fell in a cadence she recognized without memory, and green lay underfoot where moments before there had been slick rock. She looked up because she could not do anything else. The cave had become a corridor of light. Beyond it, cliffs stepped down toward a river that caught the sun on its back and carried it laughing. Wind moved through tall grasses. Distant roofs, stone folded into living rock, caught and held the glow like hearths. The guards shouted again, but now their voices sounded like old broadcasts, lost between frequencies. One tried to rush forward and stumbled as if the ground had grown an inch of courage under his feet and wouldn't let him trespass. Auren tightened his arms around her and stepped. The sensation wasn't falling. It was like stepping from cold shade into a courtyard, warmed all day, an astonishment of comfort. She felt the change in him as much as saw it. The pallor that the compound's light had laid on his skin burned away. His hair lifted in a breeze that smelled of pine resin and rain-warmed stone. The runes along his chest dimmed from flare to ember, satisfied and sure. Behind them, the compound's world shrank like a closing hand. She turned her head once, the way you do when you leave a room you lived in too long, and saw the white hallways like bones against a gray sky, small and impossibly far. Auren's breath drifted across her temple. "Stay with me," he said, though the ask in it had the force of vow. She slid her arms around him and held on. The light surged again. The seam narrowed. Voices from the ridge snapped back into the cut air and lost meaning. The last thing she heard from the world she was leaving was her own name muffled by distance. The last thing she felt before the light became everything was his mouth against her hair and the quiet, possessive certainty of the word that had freed her. Mine. Light released them like breath long held. They stepped onto sun-warmed stone, and the world opened. Terraces carved into the living cliff. Stairways spiraling down toward a river that braided silver through green. Water fell in veils from high arches where swallows darted and stitched the air. Far below, fields fanned outward in crescents, their edges lined with hearth smoke plumes that rose, thinned, and vanished into a sky the exact blue of his eyes when they laughed. Heat settled around her gently, not the sterile press of a heater's coil, but the full, forgiving warmth of weather that remembers names. The scent was pine and wet stone and something sweet she couldn't place until wind shifted and brought honey, crushed herbs, and the amber musk of sun on skin. She stood without meaning to, just stood, and let light paint her bones. He watched her take it in, the fierceness in him softened by relief. The runes across his chest had cooled to a steady ember, lines of gold embedded beneath skin like sap caught in old wood. When he looked back at the cliffs, his jaw eased with an ache that wasn't pain. Home lived in him so completely that standing here restored what even ice had not taken. She lowered her gaze and found the faint crescent at her throat answering the light, no longer a shy glimmer, but a sure, soft glow. Where his fingers had held her wrist through the flight, a second mark had unfurled along her inner arm, a slender line tipped like a flame toward her palm, as if pointing the way her hands would learn to go. "Is it safe?" she asked, but the words lost their edges the moment they left her. Safety was a small thought in such a wide place. He took her hand, always that first truth, and led her along the outer walk. People turned as they passed. They were sun-brown and bright-eyed, hair threaded with beads or bound back with cords the color of river stones. They wore leather and linen softened by use, metal cuffs etched with symbols like his. They touched easily, arms slung over shoulders, palms pressed to cheeks in greeting, foreheads set together for a breath before parting. The sight of it struck something under her ribs. A loneliness she had worn like a quiet uniform stirred, lifted its head, and began to unknot. Some of them stopped outright when they saw her marks. Surprise moved through the crowd like wind through wheat, a thrum, a turn, a whisper that wasn't distrust so much as awe, as if a story they had told their children for too long as a comfort had walked up the stairs and asked for water. He led her to a broad platform halfway down the cliff, shaded by a high vault that channeled the waterfall into a thin silver sheet along one edge. The air there was cool with mist. He pressed his palm to a stone plate set into the wall. Gold traced the lines of his hand, and the door ground open. The chamber beyond breathed of cedar smoke and old light. A fire bowl burned low at the center, and over it hung a disk of hammered metal, marked in the same script that lived in his skin. Shelves hewn from the cliff held bowls, blades, woven cloth, things made to be held and used and repaired. Everything here looked touched, nothing sealed behind glass, nothing preserved by being kept away from warmth. He moved like someone entering a temple and a childhood kitchen. He stoked the coals, poured water from a jar into a shallow basin, and set her hands to soak. Her fingers looked small and pale against the bowl's dark ceramic. The heat climbed her wrists in a slow, convincing tide. He knelt across from her, and with the patience he wore, like a second skin, told her what the marks meant. In this place, runes didn't appear, because a council declared them. They formed at the border between two lives when the bonfire recognized its other. He spoke of the first pairings, how, when one held the other, their marks learned each other's shapes, how names were less important than pulses, how vows were not signed but worn, legible to anyone with eyes and the humility to look. "If I am marked because of you," she said, "does that mean I'm not mine?" His mouth tightened at the corner. The possessive heat in him rose, familiar and anchoring. But when he spoke, it wasn't to erase her. It was to define the shape of belonging. You are not the colds. You are not the silences. You are not the rule that says touch is rationed and love is a weakness. You are yours, and you are mine, and those truths don't swallow each other. They keep each other warm. The water cooled. He lifted her hands out and dried them carefully with cloth burnished soft by 100 washings. His thumb paused at the new line along her wrist. When he kissed it, the light there brightened, and a filament unfurled from it like a tendril seeking sunlight. It didn't hurt. It felt exactly like a door inside her ribs opening to air. He stood and gathered a shirt from a peg on the wall, the color of late wheat. He slid it over her shoulders with the same honor he might give a cloak at a threshold. The linen fell to her thighs and smelled faintly of smoke and the oil he rubbed into leather. When he fastened the tie at her throat, his knuckles brushed the crescent there, and another faint line bloomed across her collarbone, a translation in gold of his vow. "Come," he said, and led her deeper. Stone Hall became open ways became sun. They spent that first afternoon learning by walking. He showed her where terraces opened to the river and the places children ran their hands through the falls to feel their palms spark with harmless light. A gray-haired woman grinding herbs lifted her hand to greet them. When her gaze fell on the marks at Seraine's throat and wrist, it softened into something like gratitude. A boy with twig-thin arms skidded to a stop and stared, then laughed, as if the world, for once, had brought a story without breaking it. "What do I say to them?" she asked, and he answered, "You don't owe them words yet. Let them give you warmth first. Speech belongs to comfort here." They ate on the upper terrace, food that tasted of sun and salt and leaves that had once held rain. She fumbled at first with the looseness of it all, no trays to be slid under doors, no precise minutes measured out and marked. He watched the panic rise and ebb in her and steadied her every time with palm to wrist, palm to back, the touch that said, "I see you without asking you to be seen by anyone else." As the sun tipped west, he took her to a place where the cliff shouldered outward and made a narrow peninsula of stone. The wind there tasted like iron and clean water. He slowed, and she felt a change in him, anticipation that was also ache. At the promontory's tip, a tree clawed from the rock itself, bark silvered by spray. Hanging from its lowest branch, bound by a leather thong that age had polished, a disk of crystal turned slowly in the wind. It held, impossibly, a whisper of fire. She reached for it without thinking. Heat woke at the center of the disk, answering the heat beneath her skin. He didn't stop her. He set his hand beside hers so their fingers bracketed it. The trapped ember rose and steadied like a small star. The light from it painted his face with old vows. "This," he said, "is what I stayed for." He told her then, fully, how the sealing had happened, how the last keepers laid their hands over his heart and pressed the ember down into him until his pulse took its rhythm, how the Old Ones sang the names of all who had ever been paired beneath the high vault to teach the fire the shape of staying, how ice grew not as punishment but as protection when fear finally burned itself out of his era and left them this narrow passage between times. When they were finished, he turned his hand beneath hers and laced their fingers across the disk. The ember's light throbbed once and tugged, gently, toward her. A filament of gold jumped from crystal to skin and stitched a tiny mark at the base of her thumb, a compass needle pointing toward his palm. "You will never be lost here," he said. The day bled itself into evening. Crickets started in the cracks. The river darkened, kept its silver only at the quicks and bends. They walked back through a dusk that did not make the world smaller, only softer. Torches woke along the paths, banked low, their light the kind you can stand near without blinking. In the chamber, he lit the bowl again and set his forehead to hers. It wasn't a claim. It was a temple bell rung once, then left to sing itself out. She felt, as surely as she had felt any weight or hand, the ache in him that had no word in her old tongue and too many in his, relief, hunger, reverence, possession that was another word for shelter. "Will I ever have to go back?" she asked, "because fear can rise even where there is nothing left for it to eat." He didn't make her wait. "No." His voice softened to a blade sheathed in velvet. "You're not going back, Seraine. The cold world can't have you. You're mine." Her eyes stung. The sentence did not close around her. It opened the horizon and told her it would not end where ice began. "Keep me," she whispered, and he answered, "Always." She slept that night without dreaming that something would be taken. When she woke before dawn, the chamber had turned blue with the kind of morning light that makes everything look like the first time it was seen. He lay on his side with one hand beneath his head, the other, inevitably purely, on the place over her heart. The crescent at her throat shimmered in answer. The line along her wrist had thickened to a ribbon finer than silk. They spent the next days learning the liturgies of a living place. She learned the path of shadows across stone at noon, and where the best seat to watch the river's laughter could be stolen with a decent excuse. She learned the names of herbs and the way the leaves themselves leaned toward a hand rather than away. She learned how to braid ropes strong enough to tie a boat and soft enough not to burn the palm. People learned her too, first the shape of her silence, then the way her voice warmed when she forgot she was supposed to ration it. Her old fear that being claimed would erase her melted under smaller proofs. An elder pressed figs into her hands because her marks had brightened after she had laughed. A child fell asleep with her head in Seraine's lap because the light at her wrist hummed in time with a lullaby. Women with torque-strong arms showed her how to carry water in a yoke without bruising, how to rest the weight on bone and balance rather than on muscle alone. Everywhere she went, touch announced itself as language rather than theft. A forearm to forearm in greeting. A cheek leaned against a palm to say, "I hear you." A forehead to forehead for thank you that means, "I feel what you feel and do not turn away." At dusk on the fourth day, she noticed something new. When he came up behind her and set his hands at her waist, the marks beneath her skin didn't only glow, they braided. The ribbon along her wrist sent a filament toward his rune at the base of his thumb. The crescent at her throat extended the thinnest line toward the sigil just under his collarbone. Light met light, tested, interlocked, then rested. The sensation was a door settling fully on its hinges. "What does it mean when they do that?" she asked, half afraid to hear the answer and half already knowing it. "It means there is no seam," he said, and smiled with an odd ferocity that made her knees weak. "It means the worlds have stopped arguing about you." The only shadow on the newness was the memory of the white compound, not as longing, but as the ache of an old bruise when weather shifts. Once, standing at the cliff's edge where wind combed the grasses, flat and irresistible, she said quietly that there were children there who had never been chosen. There were people who would never know what it is to be touched and not measured. There were her own footsteps in corridors that would never hear her again. He set his hand at the nape of her neck and turned her gently until her forehead found his. The runes brightened in sympathy, painting the air between them with thin threads of fire. "The cold takes and forgets," he said. "The fire keeps and remembers. You cannot heal a machine by giving it your heartbeat. But if there is a door, someday, for those who have not been held, we will open it." "We," she repeated, catching on the word like a hand on a rung, and the new mark at the base of her thumb warmed in agreement. When harvest came down the tiered fields and the first festival fires were stacked and waiting, someone asked if they would stand at the bondstone. It wasn't required. Nothing here used force to make beauty happen. People gathered because they wanted the sound of vows to ring down the river and back again. They went in twilight, when the cliff threw a long, cool shoulder over the terraces. The bondstone rose from the ground as if it had grown there, its face polished by centuries of hands. There were no priests. There were witnesses. The air rustled with their living. Children perched on stair rails. Elders leaned on canes carved with names. The bowl of the sky held a single early star. He faced her with his hands open. She placed hers inside them. The marks braided again, brighter now, and she felt the fire move in her, not as something foreign, but as a memory returned whole. He spoke first, because his culture loved first truths. "I waited in the ice and did not die because I had already learned what living for someone feels like. I knew your absence the way a body knows hunger. I know your presence like warmth. You are mine, not as a possession to be kept from yourself, but as the thing I shelter by being myself." She didn't think about words. They came. "I lived in a place that taught me to speak so softly, even my own heart could not overhear itself. You heard me anyway. You reached for me without asking if I deserved it. You are mine, not so I can own you, but because being yours is the first way I've ever recognized my own hands." He lifted her fingers to his mouth and kissed the compass mark there. The fire answered, and lines wrote themselves sweetly across the insides of her wrists, looped her collarbone, touched her sternum with the lightest curve, an alphabet finishing its lesson. Around them, the crowd did what crowds do when something right happens. They made a sound that lived somewhere between laughter and weeping and applause. Someone struck a drum. Someone else began a low, lilting melody she realized had been under the river's song since the first time she stood here. He leaned until their foreheads met and said the only words he had ever needed for endings and beginnings both. "Come home." They spent the night under a roof that listened to rain. He taught her the names of stars in a language that did not separate constellations from stories. She slept with one hand at his throat because she loved the feel of breath moving under her palm, proof of a promise kept through absurd distances. In the morning, mist lay over the river like silk, and the terraces shone as if the world had been polished. Children ran along the stone lips of the channels, balancing with arms wide. A woman with flour on her fingers carried a loaf wrapped in cloth towards someone who would be glad to see her. Two men bowed their foreheads together in the shade of an arch and kept them there, making a small private fire of comfort before parting. Everything, everywhere she looked, was warmth choosing itself again. He came up behind her at the overlook and set his hands on her hips, thumbs aligning with the new lines that had appeared there during the night like dawn sneaking under a door. She leaned back until the whole length of her rested against him and watched the day make itself. "Tell me again," she said, "because some words are better every time you hear them. You're not going back. The cold world can't have you. You're mine." "And you are mine," she answered, and felt the braid of light under her skin tighten with a happiness so steady it surprised her that it didn't hurt. He kissed the place where her jaw turned to her throat, the place where breath and speech and vow live closest together. Far below, the river took a bend and flung sunlight into their faces, a gold so playful it felt like a benediction. They walked then, down the long steps, past the herb tables and the drum, past the place where the crystal disk turned in the wind and kept a small, tireless star. People touched their forearms in greeting and did not take more than they gave. A little girl ran up and offered her a string of blue-dyed beads. Seraine bent, and the child looped it over her hand, careful not to cover the light. "What now?" she asked, not with the fear of someone waiting for orders, but with the curiosity of someone who finally had days to spend. "Now we live where warmth is not an apology," he said. "We eat when the day asks. We work until our bodies sing. We rest where it smells like home. We touch without counting. We keep the fire and let it keep us. If a door opens to those who are cold, we hold it. If not, we make one." She laughed, that new sound that surprised her with how easily it fit in her mouth. He caught it with his fingers and set it, invisible and permanent, somewhere under his ribs. The sun climbed. Swallows stitched the air above the falls. She reached for his hand and felt, with bone-deep certainty, the compass in her skin swing and settle. "Home," she said. "Always," he answered. And the world, which had once been all corridors and rationed breath, widened until even memory had to step aside to let it through. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.